Okay, so can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So my name is Charles Parker, and first I'd like to thank Matthias for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Center for Natural Hazards and Disaster Sciences. I met Matthias in one of these wonderful pedagogical courses that we're allowed or forced to take, depending on your perspective. And it turned out that I had not heard about this constellation, this risk group, and he had not heard about the Center for Natural Hazards and Disaster Science, or CMDs for short. So he invited me to come here and talk about that a little bit today. So what I'm going to do is introduce the center, tell you a little bit about its history very quickly, tell you about some of CMDS's research, some of the activities that are going on. If you're interested, it's possible to plug into some of those. Also tell you a little bit about some of the challenges and promises of interdisciplinary research, and talk very quickly about three of the interdisciplinary projects that we have going on at CMDs. I myself have done some interesting work in what you could call risk governance or crisis management. I wrote my dissertation on arms control, these weapons of mass destruction arms control regimes, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention. And then I switched more to these crises of nature more recently, studying the climate change negotiations, looking at civil protection cooperation in the EU, doing some case studies of warning response problems like Hurricane Katrina, these Icelandic ash cloud events of 2010 and 2011. So CMDS is a very nice environment for me to be working in. CMDS, it started back in 2010. It got one of these research grants, these strategic research areas that the Swedish Parliament gave out in the autumn of 2009. And it started out pretty much mostly as a research school. We concentrated on PhD students, but we also got some money from the MSB, the Civil Contingency Agencies, to have researchers, postdocs, and some more senior people. We got a positive evaluation in 2016. CMDS was renewed and became kind of a proper center with a new board. We have a director now, a fellow that's a hydrologist. He calls himself a social hydrologist, Giuliano De Baltazari. And now we can say that we're off and running on trying to fulfill this interdisciplinary promise. CMDS is kind of an interesting setup because it involves Uppsala University, it involves Karlstad University, and also the Swedish National Defense University. And then we have a number of different disciplines that are involved. So we have earth scientists, a variety of hydrologists, seismologists, volcanologists. We have engineering people. Mikko is involved in CMDS. We have social scientists, Department of Government, and also the Peace and Conflict Department. And then the people from Karlstad are also mostly social scientists, as are the people at the National Defense College. So it's a little bit of a challenge bringing all these people together, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but also it's a lot of benefits as well. So in the first round of CMDS, we actually had 29 people finish PhDs. 6 of those were social science PhDs. At present, we have 17 ongoing PhD projects. We have 9 ongoing postdocs, and we also have a number of seminars and activities that I'll tell you about. We have an exciting website if you want to check out CMDS's activities, and also even a Twitter account. So last year we published an article talking about the CMDS framework. It was published in a journal called Earth's Futures, and it tried to lay out a research agenda. And that was one of the figures. I won't go into all of this, but it focuses on the interplay between natural hazards and vulnerabilities. And if you're a political scientist like me, you're very interested in this relationship between politics and policies and impacts of hazard events, and vice versa. And we're interested in seeing those at different levels, whether it's the local level, the national level, transboundary events, and then also the global level to try to regulate some of these things. So let me tell you now a little bit about some of CMDS's activities. We have a summer school that we've given the last 2 years, and then we're going to be doing again in August 24th to 28th, coming up this year. There'll be some information about that on the website. The first year we had all these new doctoral students, so we used it to help give them an introduction into what we call natural hazards and disaster studies. We also opened it up to people from around the world. There was a lot of interest. We've had applicants from all over the world. The lecturers are a variety of natural and social scientists. And yeah, we've been pretty pleased with how that's performed and the interest. It's also been sponsored by this European Geoscience Union. So CMDs has been involved in organizing, participating in international events. This past June, this Northern European Conference on Emergency and Disaster Studies took place right here in Uppsala. CMDs was very involved in the organization of that, had a number of seminars as well. CMDs has also represented this European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction. That's our fearless director there giving a keynote address, Giuliano Di Baltasari. That took place in Rome. So we have another event, some of them possible for people to plug into. CMDs is very interesting with trying to be useful, have relevant practical knowledge. So we have a dialogue between academics, practitioners, decision makers, and also other societal stakeholders. We have a reference group that consists of the MSB, the Civil Contingencies Agency, SMHOE, CIPRI, amongst others. Every other year we have this forum that's in the past been organized together with MSB. We had it last year in Karlstad. We'll have another one in Stockholm this coming October. Once again, there'll be some information on the website. It's possible for anyone to sign up and attend that. We also have a regular seminar series and panel discussion. Recently we had one in Stockholm looking at the future of disaster risk reduction. We had some people from the Swedish Red Cross and also MSB speaking at that event, some academics as well. We'll be having another seminar series in January and then in February. Information about that is on the web. Once again, if you see a topic that you're interested in listening to, you're welcome to come and join in. So I'm a political scientist. What are we interested when it comes to the politics and governance of crisis, risk, and disaster? Well, we're very interested in collaborative crisis management. Obviously, when a disaster strikes or an emergency happens, requires a number of different organizations and actors to come together, collaborate, cooperate, coordinate. That's not easy. We're interested in what can be learned from crisis events. So in other words, the post-crisis reform phase. We've also interested in a lot of the international cooperation that goes into risk governance, whether that's climate change, disaster risk reduction, sustainable development goals. There's a lot of overlap there. You probably all know that in 2015 we had 3 new agreements, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, and also the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a lot of overlap in that. So we're interested in how these agreements get negotiated, how they get implemented, whether they have any impact in achieving the goals that they've been set up to address. A number of political science or research projects. We have one that's called Trampoline. I'll talk more about that in a moment, about looking about whether natural hazard events actually drive policy change when it comes to disaster risk reduction. That's a VR project. We have another colleague named Daniel Norset that's very involved in these wildfire responder networks, looking once again at collaborative governance. EU civil protection networks. We have a civil protection mechanism. You may have noticed when we had the big fires here in Sweden that the EU was involved in helping us respond to those by sending helicopters and planes to drop water in the fire. That's due to the civil protection mechanism. And then we have some projects looking at international climate cooperation negotiations there. Okay, I'll say a few words about the challenges and the promise of doing interdisciplinary research. And I stole this slide from Giuliano. He found this little cartoon with some of the different ways that maybe different disciplines view one another. You may notice, as I did, if you're a political scientist, that we're missing from this slide. So that's one thing here. But I don't mind, because as a political scientist, I like to quote Aristotle, who always said that politics was the master science. And why did he say that? Why did he say that politics was the master science? Well, because all things in the end happen in a political context. So some people like to say that the lawyers rule the world. Other people say that accountants rule the world. But in the end, it's the politicians. So I've been involved in other interdisciplinary environments. a MR project that had engineers, had economists, had social scientists. And it's kind of interesting. I would do something slightly different in terms of the stereotypes. I would say that the natural scientists are very good at diagnosing what the physical properties of different hazards, if you're interested in natural hazard stuff. Engineers are best at the technical solutions. We heard Miko talking about, like, well, what's the best way to power societies and have a lower carbon footprint? They can tell you the different trade-offs there. Economists are best at doing the cost-benefit analysis. And then, of course, the politicians and political science, well, we pay attention to the rules, the laws, the institutions, the incentives, taking into account the different interest groups and stakeholders and how that plays out in the political process. I can say in the MR project, we had a lot of engineers. First, they become amateur economists because they like the economics. That seems to make sense to them. But then when they show the decision makers what the best technical solutions are, and they show them what the best economic cost-benefit analysis they are, they're sometimes puzzled why the decision makers in the political sphere don't do what they're told. So then they become amateur political scientists last. Now, we can say in the CMDs that it's challenging to do truly interdisciplinary research. It's very useful and positive to have these interdisciplinary conversations that can spark a lot of new ideas. And I think a lot of people were inspired to do slightly different things based on the conversations we had. But now what we're trying to do is actually to move from this conversation to actually having some research collaborations. And we have 3 going on right now that I'll tell you very quickly about. One is this VR-funded project that I'm involved in. And it's basically trying to look at the relationship between hazard events and policy change and whether we actually see any changes. We've done a preliminary study that we've sent into this Nature Sustainability journal. We'll see if they like it. But we looked at the Hyogo framework implementation, then we cross-referenced the progress with a number of different hazard severity factors and frequency, trying to see whether people that were hit by a lot of natural hazard events, if they had a high number of fatalities, or a large number of people affected, or large-scale economic losses, whether they performed better in implementing their DRR promises. And what we see so far is it doesn't have much of an effect at all. In fact, there was no result. So 85 countries. And I think this kind of squares the anecdotal evidence. I can say that we political scientists, we often look at case studies where we see change. So people will often take a big event where you see a reform and they'll study why did the reform happen. And a lot of times they talk about these windows of opportunity, the disaster reform hypothesis, but they pick these sort of single cases that tend to be outliers. So in other words, the results are overdetermined. It's still interesting to see why we get change in those cases that we do, but we were interested whether we see a pattern. And at least in these cases, we don't. Nonetheless, some interesting cases pop out, some that actually confirm this picture. Like Canada and Australia, where in one case you have Australia having a lot more fatalities than Canada, similar countries, yet Australia didn't perform any better than Canada. We also have some interesting variation, for example, Brazil and Colombia, where you actually have them hit by similar types of big events that cause similar amounts of large economic losses. But Brazil performed poorly and Colombia performed well. So that's one of the things that we want to look into there and see if we can diagnose why do we see this variation. Giuliano de Baltazari, he has a hydro-social extremes project. That's a ERC-funded project. And this is where he gets into his social hydrology and is doing some case studies in a number of key cities and also more broad global analysis. If anyone's interested in that, I can put you in contact with him. Then we also have a project that's being led out of the Peace and Conflict Department by Nina von Oxenkool, looking at drought in the Anthropocene, propagation, interactions, and feedback, looking at the interplay between drought, agriculture, migration, and conflict. She's done a lot about looking at the connections or lack thereof between climate change and conflict as well. Once again, since time is short, I won't go into more detail of that, but if you're interested, I'm happy to put you in contact with Nina. Okay, so speeding through to our exciting conclusions, there's a few closing remarks. that I actually think CNDS is an interesting research environment and the idea is to provide incentives for doing this cross-disciplinary research, particularly for early career scientists, which is sort of our focus, even though now in the CNDS 2.0, we're trying to be much more of a multi-generational research organization with people at different phases of the career. So PhD students, postdocs, and then more senior people as well. And then thinking about what are not only the challenges of interdisciplinary research and conversations and projects, but the value as well. And trying to capitalize on the plurality of methods and knowledge that we have in the center, and then using this as a platform for applying for money. This trampoline project is funded by the Swedish Research Council, VR. This is an example that we are actually able to be competitive when we combine these competencies of the earth scientists and social scientists. And I think there can be some other exciting constellations as well. And then as a platform actually to deliver this interdisciplinary research. And I'm hoping that we can make some progress in doing that. Our current funding lasts till 2022. And then we'll see what happens, whether there'll be a CNDS 3.0 or not. And I'll be happy to come back then and tell you what we found. So thank you very much.